Thank you very much for joining us on this all-new edition of the India Development Debate on this Monday evening on ET Now. I'm Supriya Srinath. Right now, we will be putting the focus on data localization, but at 9:30 p.m., we shift the debate to where the narrative really is heightening, and that's MJ Akbar, who's decided to dig in his heels. He has actually slapped a criminal defamation suit against Priya Ramani, the first woman who came out and talked about her Me Too movement with Mr. Akbar. Thank you very much. Like I said, I'm Supriya Srinath. Global e-payment firms and online service providers better watch out because the law on data localization is finally here and it is not being deferred. With the deadline to transfer their customer data to Indian servers coming to an end today, the future is uncertain for the likes of Google and Amazon as far as their Indian businesses are concerned. Sources do tell your channel that the RBI has ruled out any extension to the deadline and wants e-payment companies to store end-to-end transaction details only in India. The central bank has also rejected a proposal by overseas service providers to allow data mirroring, which allows them to retain a copy of the data on this overseas servers as well. In fact, the standoff has assumed political proportions, but some of the US lawmakers now raising the red flag over the proposal. The main grouse of offshore service providers like Google and Amazon is that the proposal, which forms a part of the draft e-commerce policy, will hurt their businesses rather adversely, even as it undermines India's economic growth. The slugfest over the Modi government's data localization mission and what it means for businesses, both Indian and foreign, is a big topic of discussion and debate right here on the India Development Debate this evening. Mukesh Aghi, President and CEO of the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, joins us right here. Sameer Nigam, co-founder PhonePe, AP Hota, former MD and CEO of the NPCI, and Neha Chaudhary, Public Policy Lead, TRA Law. Thanks very much, each one of you, for being with us. And Mr. Aghi, it's only fair that I begin asking you the questions because it's service providers from the US who've raised a sting. The US-India Strategic Partnership Forum has pushed for a deadline extension. We've also seen US senators write to the Prime Minister for relaxation of norms. But it looks like the government and the RBI are in no mood to entertain. They have stuck to the October 15 deadline. There is no going back. In that sense, are you disappointed as a forum, and what is really the way forward?
Well, I think first is I think we respect the local law, local requirement, and the multinational companies are willing to adhere to that. I think more important is this: we need to have a transparent, consultative process, which has not been there with RBI. The objective is to understand what kind of data is required, and give us a little bit extra time so we can meet all those deadlines itself. So our request is give us time. Tell us in more details through a process as to what is needed, and we'll support it.
Sameer, PhonePe and Paytm have been a big backer of the RBI's directive to localize data. You ready? But isn't there a contradiction between having a liberal FDI policy on one hand and a data localization policy that is considered protectionist on the other? Does this in any way amount to the fact that there may be a double speak of sorts by policymakers here?
Absolutely not. We are 100% owned by Flipkart, which in fact has a lot of international investors. We are majority owned now by Walmart. Our investors see absolutely no sort of difference in opinion with where we stand on data localization. See, ultimately, I think if we talk about data localization for things like content, for things like technology, that would be restrictive. We're talking about free flow of data being some sort of right of global multinational companies, but this is my financial transaction data. Health records and financial data, something that several major countries in the world have already insisted on data localization for. That's point number one. Second, in terms of actually asking for time, you have to remember about 7 months ago, every major Indian wallet company was asked to actually adhere to the new KYC norms, which are actually way more expensive and cumbersome because you have to put thousands of people on the ground to do KYC. But none of us had the sort of idea of actually saying we will wait till the deadline to not sort of abide by the regulation at all. We kept asking for extensions. We kept engaging with the RBI, but there was never this question of saying we'll hold out. This is not a political matter. This is a regulatory oversight matter. Payments worldwide is a regulated space. And so the reason that we are actually saying that we sort of agree with the data localization norms is that this is consumers' data. It needs to be protected. It needs to be protected globally.
Okay. So this isn't a political issue. This is really an issue as far as the regulations are concerned. Mr. Hota, on this panel, you're someone who has overseen the NPCI and knows the payment space extremely closely. Is 6 months really enough to comply with RBI's directive? Should they have considered an extension today, at least with respect to the time? Because, I mean, you look at players like a Google and Amazon, they're saying they're not ready yet and they've got big operations.
In my opinion, 6 months is too short a time to comply with the directive. You know, the directive has got 5 key elements. First, data, it has to be stored only in India. The second is there has to be a unfettered access to supervisory access to data. The third is about the entire data, that is also very important, entire data. Had it been data just the number of transactions, a basic amount of data, really this is one thing, but this is the entire element of data, end-to-end data. And fourth, obviously the timeline to comply with that, and fifth, the December 31st timeline to give the system audit report. To complete this activity, 6 months is too short, and I do not know in the next 2.5 months that the companies have got to get it audited. Now that deadline is over and they know for certain that there is no compromise on that and they would have to comply with, obviously tomorrow morning they will have to start working towards fully complying with that. And I do not think the time would be this is adequate, but the companies, instead of questioning the rationale of the regulator, had they started the work in right earnest right from the beginning, possibly they would have gained some time. Now that this much of time has gone only in lobbying, in working out an alternate approach, and now it has not worked out, possibly they will have to start working, and 6 months is too adequate. In my view, if the entire data would have to be to reside in India, their time is somewhere 2 to 3 years. That is how really I look at it.
Okay, Mr. Hota, give me a minute because I want to go across to Neha. Neha, is it the best way to monitor and supervise data? And that really goes down to the crux of this debate, because why can't RBI as the regulator not have the same supervisory powers irrespective of where the data is stored or processed? I mean, as long as these foreign entities are compliant with Indian law. So the moot question is this the best way to move forward and monitor and supervise data?
Thanks, Supriya. I think you're absolutely right. I do think that different countries around the world have looked at different ways in which their regulators do monitor and have supervisory access to data. I do think that the RBI localization mandate, where it talks about the regulator having unfettered access, supervisory access to data, is a little bit problematic, because it's not clear again what is the specific problem that they are trying to solve, for which they need this hard localization mandate of storing the data only in India, right? So, for instance, companies, they have been opposing the localization mandate in its entirety, but as an alternative had also proposed keeping a copy in the country. So, if indeed the rationale of the circular was monitoring data and having supervisory access to it, then it's not clear to me why just storing a copy of that data in India, why that doesn't achieve the purpose, number one. Number two, even the language of the, again, I go back to the language of the circular where they talk about unfettered supervisory access, right? And this is, in the larger data localization debate that's been taking place in the country, whether in the context of the localization circular, the draft data protection bill, or the e-commerce policy, there is that fundamental question of, can you talk about data localization without also talking about surveillance law reform and access and reforming the law in the country by which law enforcement agencies have access to citizens' data. And I don't think it's possible or even fair to citizens if we're talking about protecting citizens' privacy, and which includes information privacy. I do think that that conversation needs to go hand in hand. Ideally, we should be talking about reforming our surveillance laws before we talk about data localization to begin with.
Okay, give me a minute, because I want to take this across to Mr. Mukesh Aghi. And Mr. Aghi, there are precedents. If you look at countries such as China, Australia, Canada, Russia, all of them have adopted data localization provisions. And according to our banking sources, 68 out of the 78 payment services in India have complied. They have gone ahead, they have adhered to the new norms. So was it realistic on your part to expect RBI to grant an extension when 68 out of 78 are in any case complying? I mean, on account of a few players, why should the RBI be changing its norms?
Well, I think you have to understand, one is when you balkanize the data in a global world, it does have an impact from cybersecurity issues, where a fraud which takes place, let's say a car gets stolen in New Delhi, it'll get used in 30 minutes in New York itself. So you just want to ensure that customers are protected. But more important is we are not saying we will not give you data. I think there has to be a consultative process. There has to be timeline to understand from the multinational companies that they're dealing with complex operation. They have global data. So the objective here is not to object to RBI's request. Our request is, let's have a consultative process. What are your needs? Okay, this is the time frame it's going to take, and we will provide you that. So I think there's no objection to the request of RBI. I think it's just a process which is sending wrong signals.
Samir, you mentioned earlier in the show that, you are foreign owned in many ways. You're owned by Flipkart, that is now owned by Walmart, so majority owned there. Paytm is now owned by Alibaba and SoftBank. The question really is that how will players like yourselves ensure data sovereignty when you don't have financial sovereignty? And that is, I think, one of the moot points why the debate went in this direction, why the norms were laid out.
That's actually an interesting point, Supriya, because I think that's exactly the crux of the matter. I don't think one begets the other automatically anyway. That's why I was actually saying that I don't think that the FDI laws or any change in the FDI laws are required for the regulator on the financial systems to say I want localization of data in the first place. The second thing here, I mean, if we become insolvent and the company were to shut down tomorrow, the data is still here until we shut down. The second thing I wanted to point out, I think one of the panelists made the observation about the multinationals having a lot more global data. Let's remember, of the 10 companies that have actually not met the deadline thus far, I'll keep the global networks aside. Most of the others are money application, digital payment companies that are in the mobile application or wallet space. They have no more data than Paytm or PhonePe. They have no less a compliance burden than PhonePe or Paytm. And let's just be very clear, in terms of volumes, in the domestic payments industry, none of them actually have more data till date either. WhatsApp has 1 million users, Google Pay is a year old, Amazon's about 2 years old. PhonePe, Paytm, MobiKwik, FreeCharge, all of us have as many, if not multiples more users till date. So the burden of actually introducing BCP, disaster recovery, localization, it's not any cheaper for us. And we actually don't have access to billions of dollars of cash flow. It's equity that we spend on building our capex out. So I think this argument that somehow it's easier for domestic companies or it's cheaper for domestic companies is just flat out flawed. As I said again, we didn't like to have to adhere with KYC guidelines for 20 rupee, 50 rupee wallet accounts, but we did. Asking for a timeline, to Mr. Hota's sort of point, asking for a timeline extension is one thing, but to simultaneously continue saying, localization is bad, you're balkanizing the internet. I'm not balkanizing anything by saying my individual consumer's payment data needs to be kept localized. This is not about free flow of information.
Just hold that thought, because Mr. Hota, do you believe this directive from the RBI or the new norms or the new rules has skewed the level playing field to benefit the domestic payment players? I mean, Samir, of course, disagrees, but is that what you believe in? And I want to also, for the benefit of our viewers and this panel, want to put out a statistic, because there is, according to studies, a huge impact of proposed or enacted data localization on any country's GDP. Research shows for Brazil and India, it could be a 0.2 to 0.1% impact. For a stronger economy like China, it could be upwards of 1%. And this is due to the undoing of productivity from major trade agreements, fall on investments, export reductions, and all of that. A, do you agree? And B, of course, the question on skewed the level playing field.
I don't think RBI means there is any such motive in that. Really, RBI is very progressive. They would obviously they have been really they would like the level playing field, but this is not the strategy to balance if there is any level field is not there. The only thing, the purpose of the data localization is that there has to be unrestricted access to data, and if the payment company, they process outside the country, and if they say that they would really just keep a copy of the data here in India, it has to be seen whether the data that is kept is actually the entire data. So, it would give a lot of confidence to the regulator if the data resides in India, in the sense that it is processed in India. It is the best if it is processed in India, kept in India, and obviously for payment system like card payment system, there are sophisticated tools, and for keeping all the tools here in India, it would be very costly. But there could have been a really way out had the card companies showed that yes, this is the way we can really achieve this goal, instead of questioning the rationale. So, there was no such motive like to help the Indian company and to put restrictions on the foreign companies. I don't think there was any such motive. Motive was that the data should be accessible. If it is kept outside the country, maybe the companies would say that our regulator is not permitting, so the law enforcement agencies might find it a challenge.
Okay.
But if it is in India, really access is pretty easy. So, I don't think there is any
yes. Okay.
any malified intention. Regulator is absolutely beyond question.
Okay. No, I don't. Yes, no. I don't think there was ever malified intention. What I meant to ask was, does this dislevel the level playing field? Was the question, but you say it does not. Neha, the data localization move by RBI comes on the back of proposals on data protection and e-commerce, where the thrust is increasingly on a more Swadeshi approach. You look at the draft e-commerce policy, it's almost, we want to go back to the Swadeshi regime. Is India perhaps taking a cue from China in this respect? Have a dislevel playing field, promote the domestic local guys, and will this really work is the big question.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because if you look at, if you follow some of the conversations that around data localization across various policy documents, if you listen to what various members of the government have been saying, or representatives of the e-commerce think tank even, China is definitely cited as one of the examples, right? And very often you come across, very often you hear, well, it worked for China, China did it, and look how it's really helped their economy. But I do think that we need to question that a little bit, right? Just because it's worked for China, it doesn't necessarily make it a good idea for India. We do want to live, and we are very much a part of a global interconnected world. We've always been a part of that kind of world. We've benefited from having opened up our economy. We've seen the negative ramifications of closing our doors in the past, and I would caution against going down that path. We also have strong international law commitments. We have constitutional commitments and guarantees that dictate what we can and cannot do. For instance, in the context of data protection, including data localization, we have a fundamental right to privacy. And there is an argument that needs to be made, or an argument that could be made, about whether data localization, especially when we're talking about localizing citizens' data, is in furtherance of that fundamental right to privacy, or it actually restricts that fundamental right to privacy. So yes, China has done it, and it may or may not have worked for China, but there are other factors that have contributed to making the Chinese digital ecosystem what it is today. So, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Fair point. Mr. Agi, will this have any impact as far as businesses investing in India are concerned? I mean, I started off this discussion by asking, there seems to be this contradiction between getting more FDI and restricting the data storage. But do American firms have an option other than comply, considering this is the last big growth market for them? Their forays into China haven't really worked. So in some sense, is this going to have an impact on businesses whatsoever?
Well, I think, let me just come back to the China example you raised earlier. China is a manufacturing economy and India is a services economy itself. And, we do get our BPO industry a lot of data coming from the US, which they work on it and then provide solution to that. So I think having cross-border data is beneficial to both US and India itself. That's one. I think, will this have an impact on the investment coming into India itself? I think every company is going to take that call itself. But more important is we are a democracy. And I think it's important in democracy to have a consultative process, more transparency, and across the border, at least our member companies are saying they want to support what is being done, initiated by RBI. All they're saying is, let's understand what your requirements are. Can it be met through mirroring? Can it be met through other solutions itself? And give us some time. So I think there's no disagreement on trying to provide what is needed by RBI to be an effective, efficient regulator. What they're saying is give us time to understand through a consultative process, what are your requirements, and we'll make it happen.
Okay, fair point indeed. We'll make it happen. Give us some time, but I don't think the regulator is going to grant that. But Samir, is storing data within national boundaries any guarantee that it is secure and can't be compromised in any way? We've seen data breaches happen all the time. There are sophisticated hacks that can transcend borders. So isn't this perhaps a little narrow way of looking at things? And one of the things that I do want to point out for the benefit again of this panel is that for India, the loss per worker due to data localization is equal to 11% of the average monthly salary, 13% in China and 20% in Korea and Brazil. Are we plunging towards bigger economic problems with something like this?
Not at all. So I think to your first point, I don't think anyone, including the RBI, is saying that this is a silver bullet. You suddenly localize data and you'll never be sort of getting cyber attacks. You're never going to have hacks. In fact, the exact opposite is what they're saying. They're saying that if an attack were to happen, if a hack were to happen, they want to be able to actually understand the scope of it. They want to be able to get to the data immediately. I think the challenge here is with this whole proposal around data mirroring, where people are saying we'll process abroad and then we'll mirror the data to India. Well, when the hack happens and if you want to get to the source of the data, you're going to be calling up regulators and data storage sort of providers in Ireland, Luxembourg, USA, China, God knows where, everywhere. The RBI is saying I want to be able to actually call the companies up, call the grievance officer up and get the details in a matter of minutes. The second point there, so no one's saying that attacks won't happen. The question is, are you better prepared to respond? Similarly, in terms of actually making all your data localized here, it actually shores up the data center ecosystem. 10 years ago, the cost of data center services in India was almost 2.5 to 3 times. I was at Flipkart 7 years ago, the cost was still almost 100% more. Today, the cost differential between services, including the multinationals who are providing cloud services in India, is about 10%. 10% is the additional cost of doing business fully localized in India. So I think there's a lot of sort of hyperbole going on here, and I think that it's also now happening. Indian startups have a voice now. I think it's a new generation of startups. We don't feel like a third world country.
Okay.
I don't
Okay.
actually like these sort of underhanded threats about how there'll be an impact to business. That's not true.
Okay. All right. So we just hold that thought. I'm going to give a quick last word to Mr. Hota, and we have to close this here, completely out of time. Mr. Hota, is storing data locally also more critical because of the way data is being harvested? I mean, do you believe this is going to help consumers here in India perhaps have more say in how their data is being used?
I suppose the consumer remains unaffected by this regulation, whether it remains within India or outside. But at the same time, if the data is within India, really the regulator has greater access. The regulator can do a lot of research and analytics, and in the days to come, artificial intelligence and the data lake and data analytics would play a very important role, and the government regulators, if they have the access, it is good for the country. As per the previous discussion, as Nigam was also telling, this regulation has nothing to do with the security, the level of security. Obviously, it has its own way of dealing with that kind of an issue. This is an issue of data sovereignty, creating data borders, and creating data borders is primarily for the purpose of data analytics and access to data for enforcement if there is a need for that.
Okay, on that note, completely out of time on this edition of the India Development Debate. Thanks very much, Sameer, Neha, Mr. Hota, Mukesh, all of you for joining in with your thoughts on data localization norms. The debate can carry on, but the regulator and the government have dug in their heels. There is no looking away from the deadline. The deadline expires midnight tonight. Everybody has to adhere to the new norms. Is this going to empower the Indian citizen with a far more say on how their data is used? Is going to be really the big question going forward. But thanks very much for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate.